The 19th century, a time of crisis, development, revolution, and social movements that settled the basis of our modern world. There were many important changes in the development of democracy and capitalism around the world.
Democracy is a form of government in which the citizens have the power in the way they can choose their representatives.
Capitalism is an economic system based on trade, industry, and means of production that are mostly privately owned and operated from monetary benefit.
In this video, we will talk about 12 events that had an impact on the previous concepts in North and Latin America, Europe, Africa, Middle East, and Asia. The independence of Colombia in 1810. The people of New Granada, now Colombia, were unhappy with Spanish rule. Camilo Torres Tenorio had written in 1809 reminiscences of offense about repeated Spanish slights against Creoles. Bogotá's patriots had a plan. On the 20th of July, they asked the Spanish merchant Joaquín González Llorente to borrow a flower vase to adorn a celebration in honor of a patriot sympathizer. Llorente refused. Joaquín Camacho went to the viceregal palace and requested an open council. They knew that this too would be refused. Patriots ran through the streets of Bogotá, claiming that both Amarin Bourbon and Llorente had been rude. The people of Bogotá took to the streets to protest Spanish arrogance. Guided by patriots like José María Carbonell, the lower classes of Bogotá made their way to the main square, where they demanded an open town meeting to determine the future of New Granada. Amarin Bourbon had no choice but to sign the act, which permitted a local ruling council and eventually independence.
The Boer Republics, 1830s. The term Boer comes from the African word for farmer and was used to describe the people in southern Africa who traced their ancestry to Dutch, German, and French settlers who arrived to the Cape of Good Hope after 1662. These farmers settled in the land surrounding Cape Town and maintained their farms through the forced labor of African slaves. Although the colony had previously been administered by the Dutch, the British officially took the control of Cape in 1806. The British began to force the Boers to change their way of life. In the 1830s, in disagreement with the British rule, the Boers moved from the coastal lands and settled in the region between the Orange and Vaal rivers. The emigration was known as the Great Trek. In the new territories, the Boers formed two independent republics, the Orange Free State and the Transvaal, later called the South African Republic.
The Panic of 1837. The Panic of 1837 was the first depression of America's industrial era. It has been the worst economic depression. It was caused by a real estate bubble and erratic American banking policy. Van Buren was elected president in 1836. He inherited Andrew Jackson's financial policies. When Andrew Jackson was president, it was a time of expansion and prosperity. Cotton production increased, agriculture expanded, cities grew, and there was a rise in sales of land and prices from them. All this led to speculation in Western lands and inflation growth. So he moved federal funds to smaller state banks and shut down the Federal Second Bank of the United States. In response to this, banks called in their loans and began suspending credits. Some banks began to close, businesses began to fail, prices to fall, and thousands of people lost their land and jobs. The crisis and the 6-year depression that followed had lasting effects on the American economy. The First Opium War, from 1839 to 1842. Opium is a highly addictive drug that was grown in northern India by the British East India Company and then shipped directly to Chinese markets. Demand for opium in South China increased, and silver was flowing from China to India. China reacted and appealed Britain on moral grounds to stop the traffic in opium. The British refused, and as a result, the Chinese blocked the trade area to force traders to surrender their opium. The British responded with force, starting the war. Britain won the war because of their advantage with their warships. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, where Chinese agreed to open 5 coastal ports to British trade, limit taxes on imported British goods, pay for the cost of the war, and give the British ownership of the island of Hong Kong.
Oriental Crisis, 1840. The Ottoman Empire, which was in nominal control, was enfeebled. Mehmet Ali, the Pasha of Egypt, decided the time was right to seize independence for that country and presumably power for himself. In 1839, his force of thousands of men in what was then Syria, now Lebanon, defeated an Ottoman army at the Battle of Nesib. This victory placed Constantinople and the eastern Mediterranean under threat, and so the British, supported by the Russians and Austrians, moved to forestall Mehmet's further advances and push him back to Egypt, as they wished to preserve the integrity of the Ottoman Empire. British victory cut the Egypt army's access to the coast, and without it they were forced to withdraw their supply chain, and a peace settlement was reached which assured the continuation of the Ottomans for a few more years.
The Realism movement in the 1850s. The Realism movement had the belief that the world should be viewed realistically. This movement began in the 1850s. It influenced the politics, the literature, and visual arts. In politics, the politics of reality or realpolitik were practiced. Realpolitik is a political system based primarily on power and on practical rather than ideological notions or moralistic and ethical premises. It shares aspects with its philosophical approach with those of realism and pragmatism. It focuses on considerations of power, not ideals, morals, or principles. It is historically associated to leaders such as Bismarck, Stresemann, and Kissinger. Realpolitik policies were created after the Revolution of 1848 to strengthen states and tighten social order. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck used realpolitik to achieve Prussian dominance in Germany.
Crimean War from 1853 to 1856. France, Russia, and Britain were all competing for influence in the Middle East, particularly with Turkey. Control of access to religious sites in the Holy Land had been a cause of tension between Catholic France and Orthodox Russia for a number of years, and in 1853 the conflict came to a head with rioting in Bethlehem, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire ruled by Turkey. Tsar Nicholas I demanded that the dispute be resolved in favor of the Orthodox Church. These demands were not met, however, and Nicholas took the opportunity to mobilize the Russian army against Turkey. Initial Russian operations against the Ottoman Empire were conducted in Romania, with the Russian army crossing the river Pruth into Moldavia on July 2nd of 1853. In response, Turkey declared war on Russia on 5th of October. The Russians destroyed the Turkish fleet at Sinope. The British and French responded quickly. In March 1854, they declared war on Russia, expecting a quick victory.
The Second Industrial Revolution, 1850s. The Second Industrial Revolution gave rise to steel, chemicals, electricity, and petroleum. Steel replaced iron, and it was used in the building of faster and smaller machines and engines, railways, ships, and weapons. The light bulb, telephone, radio, streetcars, and subway powered by electricity were invented. The development of the internal combustion engine gave a new source of power in transportation. Not everyone was benefited. Great Britain, Belgium, France, the Netherlands, Germany, and the western part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and northern Italy were benefited. Other countries were still largely agricultural, like southern Italy, most of Austria-Hungary, Spain, Portugal, the Balkan kingdoms, and Russia. They provided food and raw materials for the industrial countries.
The U.S. Civil War from 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was a conflict between the northern states that conformed the Union and the southern states that seceded from it and formed the Confederacy during Abraham Lincoln's presidency. The Union president was Lincoln, who was Republican, and the Confederacy president was Jefferson Davis, who was Democrat. The Civil War started because of uncompromising differences between the free and slave states over the power of the national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states. The Civil War determined what kind of nation the United States would be, whether a dissolvable confederation of sovereign states or an indivisible nation with a sovereign national government. and if it will continue to exist as the largest slave-holding country in the world. With its end, processes of rebuilding a United Nations free of slavery began. It led to freedom for more than 4 million enslaved Americans, established a more powerful and centralized federal government, and laid the foundation for America's emergence as a world power in the 20th century.
Cuban independence, 1868. The idea of independence had taken root in the minds of the people of Latin America thanks to the United States' independence, and it continued to grow. In Cuba, Spanish forces put down several major rebellions, including one which lasted from 1868 to 1878 called the 10 Years' War, which was led by Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. Another major attempt at independence took place in 1895 when ragtag forces including Cuban poet and patriot José Martí were defeated at the Battle of Dos Rios. The revolution was still simmering in 1898 when the United States and Spain fought the Spanish-American War. After the war, Cuba became a U.S. protectorate and was granted independence in 1902.
The Berlin Conference, 1884 and 1885. The Berlin Conference was a meeting organized in 1884 and 1885 with the objective of settling conflict claims on the territories of Africa. 14 European countries participated in it. No African delegates were present at this conference. The European nations had arrived to Africa looking for natural resources for the growing industrial sectors around the 1870s. The scramble for territory led to conflict among European powers. Rivalry between Great Britain and France led Bismarck to intervene, and in late 1884 he called for a meeting of the European powers in Berlin. In the meetings, Great Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and King Leopold II negotiated the claims to the African territory, which were formalized and mapped. During the conference, the leaders also agreed to allow free trade among the colonies and established a framework for negotiating future European claims in Africa.
Enactment of the Meiji Constitution in 1889. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan's leaders wanted to create a constitution that would define Japan as a capable, modern nation deserving of Western respect while preserving their own power. On February 11, 1889, the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, which was the first constitution and was known as the Meiji Constitution, was presented to the Japanese people by Emperor Meiji. This constitution guaranteed the Japanese population freedom of speech, publication, religion, property right, and illegal arrest. It established Japan as a constitutional monarchy with a bicameral parliament, with an elected lower house, a prime minister, and cabinet appointed by the emperor. This led Japan to become a modern state and one of the world's advanced civilized powers. The constitution remained in effect until 1947. Analyzing these events, we can observe the development of democracy and capitalism by the end of the 19th century in the different regions of the world. In Asia, Japan's democracy got to develop because the constitution permitted the creation of democratic institutions and voting restrictions loosed. And China's capitalism decreased after the Opium War, with Britain strengthening its power over the country. In the United States, with the financial crisis, the economy decreased and capitalism stopped developing. And then the Civil War, a war between the capitalists against non-capitalists, had also an impact on the economy. Because slavery was indispensable for its development, and thanks to it, the U.S. grew into an economic power. The Civil War also helped in the evolution of democracy with the destruction of slavery.
The events in Latin America were a great step towards democracy because this country fought for their rights and freedom until they got their liberty and introduced a more democratic government. These independences marked a new era, both economically and politically. In Colombia, thanks to their constitution, the people got more rights, a place and voice in their government. In Cuba, the influence of the United States in their economy and in the armies helped to achieve their independence.
Yeah.
In the Middle East, we can see that in the Oriental crisis, it was a step back in democracy because they didn't let Egypt get independence from the Ottoman Empire, and they kept it under their control for a few more years. In the Crimean War, they made a lot of progress because they established a treaty that brought peace and democracy.
In Africa, the 19th century was a time of change and development. The Berlin Conference, when the African territories were divided, improved the economy. European nations had their own colonies and could export raw materials for their growing industrial sectors and exploit the natural resources. Democracy didn't exist during this century in Africa because it was completely colonized. Only a few territories were independent. Africans didn't have voice or power in politics. The Boer republics were an example of this in conformity with the colonial rule. In Europe, the Second Industrial Revolution improved the capitalism with all the new inventions and the rise of steel and electricity. The economy in most of the countries of Europe was improved by these revolutions. Europeans could afford to buy more because of the low production costs. The form of government was radically changed by real politics in Germany. This new way of thinking was present in important events as the Prussian dominance in Germany and the liberal social policies imposed by Bismarck. Like this, we conclude our video. We hope you enjoy it.